Hello everyone, my name is Braden Wisely, and today I would like to take some of your valuable time to explore and hopefully shed maybe a little bit of light on some concepts that come up a lot in the very public, quote, debate between atheism and theism, but concepts that I don't think are properly understood by, frankly, either side of this discussion. And most of, frankly, all of these concepts relate in some way to the core concept of naturalism. Now, naturalism is a core assumption or a series of assumptions that underpins the entire study of the natural world, of science, of everything. Basically, the entire scientific method and the entire scientific community depend on the assumptions that the concept of naturalism provides. Also, I would argue that the assumptions that naturalism provides are also the bedrock for just living an everyday life as a natural, rational, engaged human being. But of course, this does beg the question of why do we need assumptions at all? Why can't we just study, learn, and know things? Well, unfortunately, humans are deeply flawed. Our senses are flawed, our reason is flawed, our lifespans are short, and we have a ton of limitations to not only our knowledge, but our ability to amass more knowledge. We are deeply flawed and deeply limited. So there are core assumptions that can't really be tested or proved, in fact, can't be tested or proved at all, but are absolutely critical to the functioning of science and the functioning of our daily lives. So, without further ado, let's get straight into it. And I guess before we, I guess there's still some ado to not go without. I am reading these directly off of Wikipedia, just so you know. These specific assumptions and the specific wording of these assumptions is going to change depending on who you're reading and when you're reading them. The number of assumptions will change, but the spirit of these items remains basically the same no matter where you go. So there you go. Okay, so now without further ado, let us begin. Assumption number 1. There is an objective reality shared by all rational observers. Now, of course, there's no fundamental way to prove that we are all living in the same reality and that we are all able to perceive the same reality, but you have to assume that we can in order to really study anything or, again, arguably, to even engage with the world. If you don't think that there is an objective reality and that everybody's reality is fundamentally and wildly different, then there's no point in studying anything because there's nothing to study. Assumption 2. This reality is governed by natural laws. So this is also a relatively simple one. It just basically is the idea that there are, in fact, things to study. That the natural laws that we discover in the world aren't going to randomly change or dramatically change for no reason, and that there aren't going to be things that we find that do not have natural laws or natural causes. Basically, again, this is just the idea that there is something out there to study, and there are things that we can learn about the universe that are going to make sense. Assumption number 3. Reality can be discovered by means of systematic observation and experimentation. And this is basically the assumption that we can, in fact, study these things, that we have tools that will work to learn about the universe, and that we aren't just bashing our heads against the wall as we do this. Again, most of these assumptions revolve around the idea that there is something to learn, and we are capable of learning it. Assumption number 4. Nature has uniformity of laws, and most if not all things in nature must have at least a natural cause. Assumption number 4 sort of ties into assumption number 2. That's sort of what I meant, that the specific wording of these will change, and sometimes people include 2 and 1. But anyway, this again is just simply the idea that we can study things, these things will have causes, and there aren't, A, the natural laws of the universe aren't going to randomly change, and B, there aren't going to be a broad manifestation of phenomena that have no cause. So it's basically the idea that we can learn about things and we can discover the laws by which they work, and we can discover the cause behind them. Assumption number 5. Experimental procedures will be done satisfactorily without any deliberate or unintentional mistakes that will influence the results. And this is one that a lot of people misunderstand. This is not putting forth the idea that humans are perfect, or that experiments are inherently perfect, or that if something is shown to be true by experimentation, it is absolutely true and can no longer be questioned. None of those are the case. This is basically just putting forth the idea that even though we are flawed humans, we can learn things about the universe, and we can minimize our flaws and our biases and our tendency to make mistakes enough to be able to gather knowledge. That we shouldn't just give up and say we're flawed and we're stupid and we'll never figure it out. That we can learn things. That's basically what this is saying. Number 6 ties very much into number 5. Number 6 is that experimenters won't be significantly biased by their presumptions. Now again, and just to be clear, this is not asserting that scientists have no bias or that their bias is negligible or that they're immune to bias or anything like that. It's just, again, saying that even though humans are vulnerable to bias, that we can learn things in spite of that, that we shouldn't give up, and that there are things that we can learn and things we can discover and things we can do working past our inherent bias and flaw. And Assumption 7 is a little bit obtuse, but Assumption 7 is simply that random sampling is representative of the entire population. Now, this seems really random. But since you can't really prove that random sampling is always going to work, and if you're not familiar, random sampling is basically, for example, when they want to know how many deer are in a certain forest, they will capture as many deer as they can within a certain area once a year, every year, to see how the population is growing or changing, assuming that if that area of the forest is having population growths or declines, that it is usually representative of the entire forest. Now, you can't really prove that that's the case because you can't just go out and you can't just fly over a forest or over the ocean and just count one by one by one. It's not practical. So you have to assume that is a good way of gathering data. And the evidence so far does seem to suggest that it is, but again, you can never prove that that's the case. Okay, so those are the 7 or more or less, depending on who you read, basic fundamental assumptions that naturalism brings to the table for science. Now again, a lot of people like to paint these as if they're some sort of crazy dogma, but I would argue that these are all like painfully basic assumptions. Like, I don't think any of these are putting forth anything that's that controversial or nuts, if you actually understand them correctly. But I think the big sticking point for people who do understand them correctly is in naturalism, there is a heavy reliance on nature and natural laws. And this is tied intrinsically with a rejection of supernatural phenomena, supernatural explanations, and supernatural law. Now, defining what is natural and what is supernatural is really tricky, but one of the easiest, but by no means the only way to define this, is falsifiability. Basically, something is a natural phenomena if it is falsifiable, basically if you can prove it wrong, whereas something is supernatural if you can't prove it wrong. Like, for example, a natural explanation for a heat wave would be, based on weather, based on wind patterns, based on tides and various other things. Whereas a supernatural explanation would be, say, that nigh omnipotent technologically super advanced aliens are manipulating our weather to slow our progress. Now, an important thing to remember is that is essentially a supernatural explanation, even though it doesn't contain the stereotypically supernatural elements like ghosts or, graveyards or whatever it is. But it's supernatural because it can't be proven wrong, and it's just a wild hypothesis that's kicking around out there. That, I think, in my opinion, is the easiest and most convenient way to define the split between the natural and supernatural. Now again, with all of this, opinions differ both in and out of the scientific community, but the broad strokes of all this remain consistent and I would argue are fairly self-evident. And these ideas obviously are not new. They've existed in one form or another for millennia and across cultures. In the West, Plato and Socrates and Aristotle are early pioneers of these ideas. In the East, Confucius, Mozi, the Buddha, and various Hindu scholars teach things that are very similar. Again, I would argue that a lot of this is relatively self-evident. But to return again, the main sticking point that I think keeps so many people from becoming true naturalists is the limitation to nature. But why is that the case? Not why does it keep them from becoming naturalists, I think that's fairly evident, but why is there a strict adherence to nature in naturalism? Well, to oversimplify, essentially trying to study and understand the supernatural being broadly things that aren't falsifiable and can't really be studied or accessed, is inherently impossible. Studying that is inherently impossible. All supernatural explanations for phenomena are inherently guesses. And the reason for this is because we can't access them, and because we can't study them, we can't gather evidence on which explanation is more likely than the others. So you have a situation in which there are infinite explanations for a phenomena once you open the door to supernatural explanations. There are infinite explanations, and you have no way of differentiating from one to the other. An easy way that someone online shared with me to imagine this is basically a deck of cards with an infinite number of cards in it, and then imagine that you are asked to guess which card is plucked out of the deck. It's theoretically possible, but wildly unlikely that you're actually going to get it right. That is basically the nature of a supernatural explanation. Now, to illustrate this a lot more clearly, because I do think this idea gets misunderstood a lot, I would like to take the case of a man named Joseph Smith, who, well, a man named Joseph Smith. There's been a lot of people named Joseph Smith, I would imagine, but this specific Joseph Smith was the founder of the Church of Jesus Christ of Latter-day Saints, which nowadays, for reasons I don't fully understand, is now called mostly Mormonism. Now, Joseph Smith was a man from the early 1800s, I believe he was born in... I don't remember, who apparently had a very miraculous experience. After a series of visions granted to him by angels, he was directed to a holy site by an angel named Moroni. Now, off on a little bit of a tangent here, Moroni is, incidentally, the most New England name for an angel I have ever heard. Hey, it's Tony Moroni. He comes bringing the gabagool. Okay, I'm kidding. I'm losing the plot here, but my irreverent mockery aside, this holy site that the angel Moroni brought Joseph Smith to happened to be located outside Smith's home in New York and is said to have held the original text of what's called the Book of Mormon, which is a priceless holy script that is said to hold the true history of the Christian church. This book appeared in the form of a great box full of flawless golden tablets, with text apparently written in ancient Egyptian hieroglyphs for some reason. It also held what are called seeing stones, which Joseph Smith apparently used to both translate the tablets and miraculously find buried treasure. So that's exciting. Sadly for us, the angel Moroni declared that Smith was not permitted to show the tablets to the public, and there are only about a dozen people who were ever said to have seen them. There were never any photographs and never any prints of the tablets themselves. Now, Joseph Smith would go on to meet his end after a wild ride of a story that, frankly, has nothing to do with us, but I just can't help but share it. So here we go. Joseph Smith and his Mormons, once he gathered a following around the Book of Mormon, he established his headquarters in Illinois, taking over the leadership of a small little town in the countryside outside Carthage, I believe, where, among other things, he oversaw a campaign for President of the United States, because of course he did. While there, a local paper, published at least in part by disaffected ex-Mormons, I should say, was very critical and relentlessly attacked him and his church. Now, basically, they accused him of what I would argue is sort of the same old stuff. He misappropriated church funds. He was predatory towards young women in the church. None of these are accusations that are unusual for very powerful religious leaders. But Joseph Smith, being very fearful and angry at the spread and popularity of this newspaper, he and the Mormon leadership commanded that the paper's headquarters be attacked and its printing press destroyed, which was carried out. As far as I know, no one was hurt or killed, but the newspaper and its printing press was destroyed. Now, not surprisingly, this caused widespread outrage both in the town and in the wider region, which Smith responded to by declaring martial law in his little rural town and trying to raise a town militia to put down any protests. So yes, this has definitely spiraled out of everybody's control. Officials in the larger neighboring cities, I should say, including Carthage, I believe, raised their militias as a response and marched on Smith's little town, and Smith decided on a much better course of action, and he fled west. Unfortunately for Smith, he would then immediately change his mind to a much worse idea, and he returned and surrendered to the local militia. There, he and his brother were arrested and charged with a variety of crimes, including treason, because you are not, as it turns out, allowed to just declare martial law. And while in custody, an armed mob stormed the jail, shooting and killing his brother, who I believe was named Hiram Smith, in the process. Smith would try to escape, Joseph Smith would try to escape, and he would be shot multiple times before either falling or jumping out of a window. It's not super clear to me. He would then be shot several more times before the mob finally was satisfied that he was dead, and left. And that is most of the reason why the Mormon Church is located primarily in Utah, not in Illinois. And as you can imagine, Smith's multiple gunshot wounds and violent defenestration is also a large part of the reason why he did not, in fact, become president of the United States. Now, my, again, irreverence aside, in modern Mormonism, in the modern Mormon Church, so to speak, Smith is regarded as a martyr and a saint for his role in standing up to government, I guess. As far as tales of martyrdom go, it's a bit of a weird one, but I guess it'll work. So there we are. But none of this has anything to do with what we're talking about today. I just thought it was such a fascinating story that I had to run with it. I have to find where I am in my notes now. I'm not going to edit this out. Okay, so let's say, for the sake of argument, getting back to the original point here, let's say for the sake of argument that the tablets and the seeing stones that Smith miraculously discovered were revealed to the public and were proven by contemporary and modern science to be both real and authentic. Let's also say that Smith did indeed show a miraculous ability to find treasure with his seeing stones. And if that wasn't enough, let's say that the scientific community found irrefutable evidence of the truth of the historical claims found in the Book of Mormon. And wait, there's more. Let's also say that the modern Mormon Church could be proven to still possess miraculous abilities. Of course, none of these statements is anywhere near true, but let's say for the sake of argument that they are. This would all be, to put it mildly, the holy grail for any theist, to have every single one of their claims validated by mainstream science. And this is obviously especially true of religions for whom most of their miracles took place thousands of years ago. This is arguably what every religion in the world is pushing for right now, and what most of them will claim that they have already done. Most religions, incidentally, do claim that they have proven all their miracles and this, that, and the other thing, but as of right now, 0 miracles have been proven. But again, let's say that it all was. Every claim ever made by the Mormon Church was 100% validated by mainstream science. So what happens now? What does this all prove? Unfortunately for Joseph Smith, it proves almost nothing. Even with every earthly claim ever made by the Mormons being scientifically validated, the supernatural claims are still just guesses. And this is really counterintuitive. But let me try to explain why this is. So basically, what we're doing is we're taking somebody who can manifest abilities that we don't understand, and we're basically taking their explanation for their abilities at their word. And that would seem to make sense because they're the ones who possess the abilities, but I hope you are beginning to see the problem here. Like, for example, let's say that a man was in court because he was suspected or had been accused of murder. And his response was, well, look what I can do. And he manifested fire or lightning right out of his hand. Well, that'd be pretty fantastic and probably grounds for some further study, but it doesn't really go anywhere to prove whether or not he is guilty or innocent of the specific charges. Now, an obvious response to this would be to say, well, but miracles are inherently tied to God because God is miraculous. Being accused of a murder doesn't really have anything to do with miracles because it's just a thing, but being able to perform miracles is inherently tied to God. Well, no. It's inherently tied to supernaturalism or supernature, but it isn't specifically tied to any one God. And that's simply because any supernatural explanation can be created or chosen that will fit all the evidence that we just put forth. All the evidence that we were previously talking about how, for the sake of argument, every single claim by the Mormons ever has been validated. Well, let's revisit that. Let's say that someone believed in simulation theory, which is basically the idea that we live in the Matrix. That's the simple way of putting it. We live in the Matrix and it's run by either super robots or super aliens or super capitalists or super communists or whatever it is. But we live in a simulation. Someone who believed in simulation theory would simply say that, of course, Joseph Smith can do miracles. Of course he can make tablets. Of course he can find treasure. Of course the Mormons have powers or whatever it is. The creators of the simulation have given them those abilities so that we all become Mormons, so we don't spend our time thinking about the simulation. And that explanation is perfectly rational. Well, if you believe in supernatural explanations, it's perfectly rational and it explains and encompasses all the evidence that's presented. And I'll give you another one. Howard Philip Lovecraft wrote a lot about alien deities, and one of his favorite alien deities was named Nyarlathotep, and Nyarlathotep was an almost omnipotent psychic and shapeshifter and an agent of chaos. His nickname is the Crawling Chaos because he's a nut and he loves just causing madness and confusing everybody, and he's really not a very fun guy. Someone who genuinely believed that Lovecraft's universe, which he referred to as Yog-Sothoth, by the way, someone who genuinely believed that universe existed would look at all the miracles and all the this and that of the Mormon church and would say, of course, that must be Nyarlathotep. Nyarlathotep must have taken the form of Joseph Smith and then done all that, found the treasure and the tablets and the this and the that, and he's using that just to confuse us, because that's what he does. And that explanation is equally as valid as any of the others. And so I hope by this point that you can kind of see the issue here. So that even when you have all this evidence, the supernatural claims are inherently inaccessible. But because this concept is really difficult for people, I'm going to keep going. Not really. Well, a little bit. I also wanted to explain that this is actually, as a matter of fact, where the religion, in air quotes, of Pastafarianism comes from. Now, if you're familiar, Pastafarianism, and yes, it has a stupid name and it's sort of supposed to, it is the religion that claims that the entire universe was created and is overseen by a semi-benevolent, omniscient being created entirely of spaghetti. And he's usually depicted with meatballs. So spaghetti and meatballs, I suppose, unless the meatballs are... Anyway. And a Pastafarian, there are incidentally very few people who unironically believe in Pastafarianism. It's almost always used as an intellectual tool, and this is essentially what it's trying to communicate, in its purest form anyway. It's simply that all this evidence that we've presented for the Joseph Smith and the tablets and the stones and the treasure and the this and the that can all be explained by saying, oh, it's the flying spaghetti monster. He put down a prophet, but he didn't want, because he's only semi-benevolent, he didn't want himself to be worshipped. He just wanted a prophet to be able to channel the energies of mankind, or whatever it is. You can make explanations all the live long day. It doesn't really make any difference what the specifics are. But that's basically the idea, is that even if someone can manifest miracles, it doesn't really go anywhere towards proving their specific claims, because their supernatural claims are still inaccessible, even if they can manifest miracles. Because again, you are just going at their word. This kind of thinking, actually, to go on a little bit of a tangent, reminds me of this kind of thinking, I should be more specific, of basically like, I can do miracles, therefore I'm correct. It reminds me of a scene from a movie that came out sometime in the early 2000s, I believe, called The Emperor's New Groove. And if you've seen it, it's a fun animated movie that's based in Peru, in pre-colonization Peru, if I remember correctly, and it's kind of out there and it's fun and it's really good. But there's a scene in which a character named Kronk, portrayed by Patrick Warburton, if I remember correctly, is confronted with a moral dilemma. And in contemplating this moral dilemma, he is approached, shall we say, by an angel manifesting on his right shoulder and a devil manifesting on his left shoulder. And they've got that backwards. But anyway, in the process of trying to decide what decision to make in this deep moral dilemma he finds himself in, the angel and the devil begin to weigh in with their respective sides. And what the devil says is, not only does he make the case that his side is, the side of the devil is just inherently more fun, but he also makes a point of jumping down in front of Kronk and doing a handstand. And he says something to the effect of, I believe, well, of course I'm right. Look what I can do. Now, the humor in that is that doing a handstand has nothing to do with which side of the moral argument you're on. But I think, probably quite accidentally, that type of thinking really illustrates the problem with this sort of like miracle theory, that you can prove the validity of someone's supernatural claims just by having them perform miracles. Because it's very much like a, hey, of course I'm right. Look what I can do. It doesn't have anything to do with the problem at hand. And not only all that, but other religions don't even respect these so-called rules about miracles, because religious people will often acknowledge the existence of other religions' miracles and then immediately dismiss them with their own supernatural ad hoc hypotheses. Now, for a few examples, I knew a guy who was a Calvinist specifically, and he and I were talking about Muhammad and Islam, and he said, and this always stuck with me, even though this was years ago, he said that he believed that Muhammad could perform miracles. But he said that Muhammad could perform miracles because Muhammad was a manifestation of a demon, or the devil himself. The Calvinist I was speaking to showed a little uncertainty in that regard, of whether it was just a demon or whether it was the devil. But anyway, he expressed the validity of Islam's miracles, but then immediately dismissed it as being a manifestation of the devil. And I can give you another example. I remember reading once that there was this Buddhist, and he was diagnosed with brain cancer, and it was, very late stage, one that has a very low survival rate. and he took to meditating every day. And he was lucky enough to survive. And so being a religious person, he credited his survival with his daily meditation and believed that he had spiritually cleansed himself and that the spirit of the Buddha had helped him and, yada, yada, yada. And I remember sharing that with a member of my family who was an Apostolic Lutheran, and they said the almost exact same thing that the Calvinists had said about Muhammad. They said, oh yes, he miraculously cured himself, but he did it because he is in league with devil powers or something to that effect. And the devil is able to seed false miracles to fool the believers. But what this all means is that even if you can manifest miracles, it means nothing to anyone because anybody can come out and just throw their own supernatural theory into the ring. And you could go forever with this. You could come up with explanations even if, again, if we go back to our Mormon example, even if every miracle in the history of Mormonism, every single supernatural claim and earthly claim was 100% proven. I should just say earthly claim because the supernatural claims can't be proven. That's kind of the point I'm trying to make. I apologize for my inconsistency. But if all the earthly claims were proven, you still wouldn't really have a case for anything. And that is the problem. That is the fundamental problem here. And to those who still disagree after all that, let me ask you, if everything I said were true, if all the earthly claims ever made by the Mormons were validated by science, would you abandon your beliefs for Mormonism? Probably not. And that isn't unreasonable. And this is true, obviously, of all miracles from every faith. They all have the same problem, and this is especially true for all these so-called proofs of God's existence that the Muslims are so fond of writing. And in fact, a lot of people in the modern English-speaking Christian world will have encountered these too, because a lot of the early Muslim proofs of God were co-opted by Christian authors and now appear in Christian apologetics and Christian theology, further proving the point that all these things can act as evidence for anyone. None of this makes any difference. Even if you have the holy grail of theism and you can prove your miracles happened, it doesn't make any difference. And to those of you who are old enough to remember this, Christopher Hitchens actually wrote and talked about this at length. I remember him mentioning once that he was willing to grant all the miracles that Jesus ever performed, but that it still wouldn't prove a word of the Bible's theology. And theists went nuts accusing him of dishonesty and accusing him of bias and this, that, and the other thing. But the reality is, he wasn't biased. Well, he may have been biased, but that was not a reflection of his bias. That was a reflection of him practicing good naturalism. Because even if you prove your miracles, it doesn't mean anything. And I cannot stress that idea enough. But moving on from this idea, because we don't have all day to go round and round and round on this, this is obviously a very obtuse and difficult idea for theists. They really don't like this. And the refutation that I've seen for this idea, and that I've seen most often that I find the most sophisticated, comes from a man named William Lane Craig. And if you don't know who he is, A, you should. And B, he is a very celebrated and successful contemporary philosopher and theologian. He claims that in order to be an atheist, one must themselves take one of the aforementioned infinite cards that we mentioned earlier, the infinite explanations for the supernatural. To be an atheist, one must themselves take one of those cards and assert its legitimacy against all probability. Now, this line of argument is a little peculiar in that it leaves the refutation of theism in place and instead uses that refutation to try to refute atheism, while not going after the initial it's a little odd, but it's not wrong. He's correct. For an atheist to say, I know for a fact there is no supernatural world, is an atheist asserting something about the supernatural world that he cannot possibly know. And so that's right. William Lane Craig is correct. Again, he doesn't, his problem of trying to prove Christianity is still in place. But he is correct about the way that this manifests or can manifest in atheism. And that is why naturalists, if practicing naturalism correctly, shouldn't assert that they can prove anything about the supernatural world, and especially that they can prove the supernatural world doesn't exist. They shouldn't assert that at all. The only assertions that naturalists can make, and that naturalism itself can condone, so to speak, is that the supernatural world is inherently inaccessible, and therefore nothing about its existence can be known. However, we can assert that the likelihood of specific supernatural explanations, or specific cards in the deck, being correct is wildly improbable. Now again, all we can say is that we don't know anything about the supernatural world. But as part of that idea, we can say that as a theist, your specific explanations are wildly improbable. That's what a naturalist can say. Now, many people will respond to that and say, well, there's tons of atheists who assert that they can prove things about the supernatural world. And yeah, you're right. I don't know what to tell you. Therein lies a difference between naturalists and atheists. A naturalist is almost always considered an atheist, but an atheist isn't necessarily a naturalist. And I think the best way to illustrate the problem that we've sort of stumbled upon is with a quote that I could have sworn was from Isaac Asimov, but now I can't find the quote again, so I have no idea. But it's a great quote, so I'm going to throw it out there, and it may or may not have been Isaac Asimov, but basically someone who may have been Asimov said that if atheism was to be a religion, it would be the only religion in history to be defined by what it isn't rather than what it is. And I think that's a very important thing to keep in mind, is that all an atheist is someone who just isn't a theist. There's tons of people who are super duper not naturalists for various reasons. They are atheists. So I do want that to be very clear. As a matter of fact, that's one of the big reasons that I started making this giant lecture thing, whatever this is because I wanted to really drive that distinction home. There's a difference between naturalists and atheists. Again, one more time, almost all naturalists are atheists, but atheists aren't necessarily naturalists. Atheism is a big camp, and naturalists are only one chunk in it. In my experience, naturalists are like 1 in 3 of atheists. Like, we really are not the majority. And if that sounds frustrating, that basically anyone who isn't a theist can be an atheist, yeah, welcome to atheism. Yeah, woo, atheism, come on in, the water sucks. I've even met atheists who believe in powerful supernatural beings, but they didn't call those beings gods, so they count as atheists, I guess. So there you go. Really, this is atheism. Nothing makes sense. Leave now while you can. Okay, getting back on track. I'm losing the plot again. The thing that William Lane Craig and many others must understand is that while asserting that the supernatural world doesn't exist isn't good science, treating specific theisms like Christianity or Islam or Mormonism as though they are wildly improbable is perfectly good science, at least as I understand it. Of course, there are much less sophisticated rebuttals to naturalism, and I'm going to go through a couple of them because I hate myself. One of the ones that you hear the most often, at least in the apostolic community, is, well, that all makes sense, but you can't use reason to understand or disprove God. Well, that's a nice idea, and it does make sense. You know, God would be, if he were real, and if he is real, I should say, would be vastly more complicated and more grand, I guess, for lack of a better word, than anything we could comprehend. However, so would everyone else's God. So would the simulation. So would Nyarlathotep. So would the flying spaghetti monster. The problem is that idea of, well, you can't use logic to understand God, and you can't use logic to disprove God, you can't use your human reasoning to go against God, could be used by anyone for any God. So you're right back to where you started, with the infinite explanations and you just randomly picking one. Now, another less sophisticated rebuttal that comes up from time to time is, well, sure, there's infinite possibilities, there's infinite potential religions, but I know that I'm right because I feel it. I feel the love of my God, whichever God it happens to be. I feel the power of the scripture, again, whichever scripture it happens to be, and I feel that connection. Okay, well, first and most obviously, feelings do not make good science, and everyone's not just going to take you at your word that you feel it, because people come and go from religions all the time. So clearly, no religion has a universal monopoly on feelings. And I cannot stress this enough, but everybody is passionate about their religion. I have talked to Muslims, Sikhs, Hindus, Christians, Buddhists, and they're deeply passionate. They're all deeply passionate about their religion. And weirdly, almost all of them think that they're the only ones that are deeply passionate about their religion. That seems to just be a universal thing with theists, is they somehow think that their feelings prove something and that they're the only ones that have strong feelings about their religion. So let me emphatically say that everyone feels passionate about their religions. Even if you could prove that only one religion had people who felt passionate, it still wouldn't really mean anything, as we discussed before. And treating your religion as the only one that has feelings and passion that's true is not a healthy way to approach religion or approach interacting with your fellow man. And to be blunt, it's quite narcissistic. Like, let's not beat around the bush. It's narcissistic. Be like, my feelings are real, but when they are passionate, or when they are passionate, it's fake and it's because of Satan, or it's because they're deluded or they're deceived. That's narcissistic. Everyone has feelings, and you should treat those feelings as equal, at least on the surface, at face value. But okay, so all of this aside, what does this all mean for the practice of science? Like, okay, so supernatural explanations are infinite and you can't choose between them, and it's all nonsense, and we can't access it. And so what does that mean for day-to-day practice of science? Well, it means that supernatural arguments, or supernatural theories, quote unquote, are almost immediately disregarded by the scientific community. Now, of course, despite what many theologians and theists will scream, this isn't a result of the inherent bias of science, or a conspiracy, or any satanic interference, or anything else. It's just the nature of our reality and our ability to observe it. We can't access the supernatural world, so we cannot gather evidence for one explanation or the other. So if you have a scientific theory and you try to tie it into some preconceived supernatural notion, your theory is probably going to get thrown out, or at best, it's going to be accepted, and the supernatural, usually creationist is how it manifests, but the creationist or supernatural element is going to be thrown out. Again, I cannot stress this enough, this is not a result of bias or of conspiracy or hatred or anything like that. It's just the nature of naturalism and the nature of science. And obviously, this phenomenon is incredibly frustrating for theists. Theists generally would very much like the legitimacy that comes from scientific validation, and they don't feel like they ever get their day in court. They feel like their ideas are just thrown out as soon as they're in. And they're not necessarily wrong. But I hope that this lecture, or whatever this is, has helped to sort of illustrate why that is, and why the scientific community operates the way that it does, and doesn't operate the way that, unfortunately for theists, most theists would like it to operate. Now, another aspect of this dilemma is that practicing scientists, and naturalists generally, are very disinterested in debating theists. They really just don't want to debate theists. And there's a bunch of reasons for this. I came up with 5. People could come up with a bunch more, but I'm going to run down my 5, and we're just going to go from there. Number 1, theists are not practicing science. Now, that isn't to say that theists can't be scientists. They can. And many are. You can absolutely be religious and be a scientist, and it's not uncommon at all. But you can't practice science as it relates to theism. It doesn't work like that. Number 2, public debates give scientific legitimacy to inherently non-scientific ideas. This is pretty straightforward, but naturalists don't like engaging in public debates with theists because the public debates are almost always advertised, especially by the theists, as, quote, scientific debates. And they're not. They're not at all. They're purely entertainment, but they have this weird veneer of authority and science and empiricism that gives way more legitimacy and validity to absolutely non-scientific ideas than that we naturalists do not think they deserve. Number 3, public debates heavily favor the side with less evidence. And a lot of people don't get this, but when you're limited in time, and you're limited in scope, usually it's only one guy against one guy, even though the vast majority of the scientific community may be behind one guy, not the other. And you generally are in a position where you have to piecemeal your evidence as like counters to each other. And so if one side has very little evidence, and the other side has an enormous amount, you end up basically presenting the same amount of evidence at the debate, which not only gives a false sense of equality, but totally misses the entire balance of the debate, because the side with the most evidence should be the winning side, but that's absolutely not how it works in a public debate, because that's not feasible. And particularly where this has been a struggle for naturalists is in the courtroom. There have been many cases where particularly Christian creationists have tried to legislate the teaching of non-science in science classrooms. And naturalists have taken them to court, and naturalists have been lucky enough to almost always win, especially recently. But it's always a struggle because, the creationists come to the debate with maybe a book and a couple other buddies, and maybe a dinosaur tooth that supposedly has organic material on it or something. But the naturalists will often come, and I've heard stories of naturalists coming to these court hearings with literally piles of books and papers that are measured in feet, like several piles of books that are 4 or 5 feet high. But then you get to the point of like, how do you ask the jury? Like, you can't ask the jury to just read insanely detailed scientific minutia for the next 8 years while they deliberate. You can't ask that. So it's this like, it often results in this like agonizing of like, what do we share with the jury? What do we leave out from the jury? Do we get a little bit of everything from every scientific field, or do we specifically go on one field that we think is going to be much more impactful and that they're really going to get? Do we try to teach the jury the basics of this stuff before going in with the evidence, or is that going to be wasting our time and limiting the amount of evidence that we actually have to bring forward? It's kind of a nightmare. It's really difficult. Again, luckily, naturalists have been pretty successful at defending science in the courts, but it is not easy, and this is something that a lot of people really don't get. But if you have less evidence, a public debate is like your ground. That's where you want to be. That's 100% what you want to have happen, and that is why naturalists do not like debating with theists. Because theists very rarely have the majority of the evidence. Very, very rarely. I would say never, because I can't think of a single time when it has occurred. But anyway, so number 4... I wrote out without realizing how much it ties into the other ones, but we're going to go with it anyway. Public debates give the illusion of equality. And I mentioned this a little bit before, but basically if there is one PhD on each side of the debate, it hides the fact that usually one of those debaters has the overwhelming majority of the entire world's scientific community behind them, and the other one will not really have a lot of scientific support. But again, when they're both up there and they're both debating, it gives the illusion of equality. And that's sort of the fundamental problem with the entire debating system, is that, again, that illusion of equality and that illusion of legitimacy. It is an illusion. And number 5. Now, number 5 is going to be a bit controversial. It might make people kind of upset and maybe some other people kind of sad. But I think from what I've seen and from the debates that I've watched that this is very underappreciated problem with debates. And that is that actual practicing scientists are not generally very invigorating public speakers. They really aren't. They're often not very entertaining, they're not very engaging, and they're not very witty. Whereas most, for example, theologians are very practiced in entertaining, engaging, and frankly, working a crowd. Because many, if not all of them, have a background in preaching, teaching, and ministry. They are very confident and very skilled and very charming public speakers. For example, William Lane Craig, that I mentioned earlier, has destroyed atheists that are 3 or 4 times smarter than him in public debates, because William Lane Craig is a really, really skilled public speaker, and he's really charming, and he's really witty, and he's really funny. Now, not to take away, William Lane Craig himself is a very intelligent man. I don't mean to imply that he's an idiot by any stretch of the imagination, but he has gone up against some downright brilliant men and has made them look kind of chummy because he is just a very, very good public speaker, and that is not uncommon. Theologians are, by their very nature, very skilled public speakers and very good at managing public opinion, both behind the lens and of the people in front of them. Now, all this together is basically why theists are so enamored with public debate. Theists love public debate. There's this idea that it is inherently scientific, and that's where they can prove their ideas. And this is why. Because it legitimizes them, it legitimizes their ideas, and it favors them in almost every regard. They have the advantage. Often theists can win public debates just by showing up, just by the very fact that they were there. They win because the ground favors them by such an enormous degree. In fact, William Lane Craig, who I just mentioned, actually challenged the brilliant atheist Richard Dawkins to a debate. And when Richard Dawkins refused, Craig not only took to the internet to make accusations of cowardice, which is, come on, but even allegedly planned to place an empty chair next to himself at the speaking event just to illustrate that Dawkins hadn't showed up. Now, that rather inane and undignified stunt may seem sort of silly, but I think it really effectively illustrates the frustration that many theists feel toward this, like, just silent stonewalling that naturalists put toward them. And I think that this frustration is very understandable. Not only are their ideas basically immediately cast aside whenever they're entered into scientific journals or academic circles, but very few naturalists will even engage them in public discourse. That's got to be very, very frustrating. And it's little wonder then that so many theists talk as if the entire world is against them, because that's probably how it feels. And I think that as naturalists, we have to be more receptive to that, and we have to be more understanding of that. And I think we should be less crappy, frankly, and less dismissive of them and their feelings and their ideas, because a lot of their ideas are really good and really well thought out. They're just not playing by the rules of science that are appropriate. But I think the most important thing to remember is, again, public debates are entertainment. They are not science, and they are not education. If anything, they make people's understanding of the discussion worse. This is also why naturalists who engage in these public debates are often attacked by other naturalists. That's pretty common, actually, that an atheist or a naturalist will debate some prominent figure. For example, when Bill Nye debated, who was it? It was Ken Ham, I believe, years ago, when I was in high school, I think. And a bunch of atheists just dragged Bill Nye through the mud. They were furious. And it's because of this, because it's just not... Ken Ham wins just by showing up. Ken Ham could show up there and just stare blankly at the ceiling for an hour, and he would still win a ton of legitimacy just for being there. He would win a ton of acclaim, and he would have a huge advantage. Now, debate, I should be very clear, debate and review are huge components of the scientific method. So there is such a thing as scientific debate, but it is not applied anywhere near the way it's applied in the public sphere. Now, this isn't to say that scientific debates are secret. They aren't. They're usually a matter of public record. But they are very arcane and slow, and they therefore rarely get any meaningful media coverage. And if they do get media coverage, the media usually grossly misunderstands what's going on, and you get this wild story that doesn't make any sense. And, of course, scientific debates rarely, if ever, end in big public showdowns that are aired on television in specific time slots. Like, that's just not how that works. So, again, scientific debate is a thing, but the public debate is not scientific. And that again, is sort of counterintuitive, but so it goes. Now, that means that a lot of people out there, if anyone's crazy enough to still be listening this far in, are probably wondering, okay, well then how do I learn about the other side? Because so many people, a depressing amount of people, only learn about the other side's ideas by watching debates, which is just heartbreaking. Ugh. So, now that I've condescended and probably insulted a lot of people inadvertently, let me say very clearly, the way to learn about the other ideas, and the only way you should be learning about the other side's ideas, is by reading their ideas. Read their books. Listen to their podcasts. This is the 21st century. The availability of information is insane, and nobody takes advantage of it. And I should be very clear here. When I say read their books, I mean read their books. I know so many people who either A, say that they learn or that they understand the other side because they watch debates, which is inane. Don't ever say that. But don't ever say the other thing that everyone says, which is that, oh yeah, I understand religions. I took world religions at my Christian university. Yeah, that's not, you don't learn about other religions by learning about them from someone who doesn't believe them. You're not going to go learn about Christianity by reading a book that Richard Dawkins wrote about Christianity. You're not going to get a great understanding of Christianity that way. That's just not how that works. So I must emphasize again, read their books, read their ideas. They're everywhere. It's so easy, especially if you're an atheist. Oh, goodness gracious. Sorry, I got a spam call. Anyway, so if you're an atheist, I hear so many atheists talk about like they've never encountered Christian ideas, or they don't know who like people like William Lane Craig is, or they don't want to read, or they don't want to... Let me be very clear. If you're an atheist and you spend most of your time arguing against Christians, right, in the United States, which I'm assuming most, if not all my audience, if there, again, is even an audience left this far in, I assume that most of you are Americans. A, Christian theology is super accessible, and B, Christian theology is super accessible. I said that realizing that it sort of meant the same thing both ways. A, there's a ton of Christian theology that's just free out there. There's tons of podcasts. William Lane Craig has a podcast. I have relatives who have Christian podcasts. There's tons of podcasts on YouTube and on SoundCloud that talk about faith and about faith in relation to the news and theology and spirituality and all that sort of stuff. There's radio programs. They're just like on FM radio, just in your car, that are basically like church services every morning. A bunch of theists and theologians and writers have just free content online. For example, C.S. Lewis, who is, in my opinion, one of the best authors to ever write in the English language, he writes a lot of books on theology, and basically all of them are not only free online as PDFs, but people have done like readings of them. So you can get free audiobooks from C.S. Lewis just online. And they're really good. They're really accessible in the other sense, in that they're not very arcane. Christian theology is pretty straightforward and pretty grounded, unlike, for example, Islamic theology is very philosophical and very sort of up in the clouds and very distant and often quite sort of legalistic. I love Islamic theology, don't get me wrong. I actually broadly prefer Islamic theology to Christian theology myself, but Islamic theology is a lot harder to just jump into, whereas Christian theology is really easy. Like, these Christian theological books are almost always written for just people to just read. Like, that's what they're for. If you read C.S. Lewis, it's great. It's entertaining. It's fun. It's witty. William Lane Craig is witty and fun, as I mentioned before. Timothy Keller's books aren't, unfortunately, as widely available. His work isn't as widely available as William Lane Craig or C.S. Lewis, but I had no problem getting Timothy Keller's books from just the library down here in Multnomah County in Oregon. Like, pretty easy to get. And you could find them both physical copies and on audiobook. Okay, I'm getting on a kind of too long of a tangent here, but the point I'm trying to make is that it's really easy to read stuff and find stuff that doesn't agree with you, and you can get so much out of it. Like, even if you're an atheist, and you think that, for example, all of C.S. Lewis's ideas are wrong, and that is frankly what I believe. The Great Divorce, which is a book that he wrote, is such a fantastic way of thinking about heaven and hell that I'm probably going to remember it for the rest of my life. Now, I should be clear, most modern Christians don't agree with C.S. Lewis's ideas, which made me quite sad when I found out about it, but it's still really fascinating and really cool ideas that will change the way that you look at Christianity. And if nothing else, it lets you have a little window into the way that other people think. And I think that's very important. And if you're a Christian who finds themselves debating atheists a lot, read some Camus or some like Nietzsche or Bertrand Russell or like Thomas Paine. Like, there's a lot out there. And boy, if you're brave, do some Dawkins or some Hitchens or some Harris, really go for it. But it's just, I think that it's important to just understand how other people think and how other people live before we spend so much of our time trying to debate them in our heads. And I should also mention, that reminds me, that when you're reading these books, don't spend the whole time trying to debate the person in your head. It's really easy to fall into that, and I've fallen into that myself, but it's just set your ideas aside and just live in their words and try to live in their head and just enjoy it. And read C.S. Lewis is basically all of this is about. Just read C.S. Lewis, please. And read Camus while you're at it, actually, as a matter of fact. Camus is also great. The Myth of Sisyphus is so good. But anyway, okay, moving on from my weird rambling book reviews. So anyway, before I got off on my weird book tangent, I was talking about the naturalists' disinclination to debate. And that disinclination, combined with the almost immediate dismissal of any theistic works from academic circles, makes theists basically feel as if the entire world, and specifically the entire academic community, are just snobs who are set against them. And it's very frustrating for them, and understandably so. And again, I would like to stress that we should be understanding of this. A lot of atheists, and naturalists specifically, like to just dismiss all theists as just sort of knuckle-dragging monkeys, but they're not. They are obviously people who are just as intelligent as we are and who have really wonderful, fantastic ideas that just don't fit into the way we do science. Or I should say the way science is done, because it is just the way science is done. But we should be understanding of that, and we should realize the frustration that they're under. But we should also remember that this frustration goes the other way. I've heard of many people working in the natural sciences who feel that many in the public, and even in their own families, treat them as though they're engaged in some sort of great satanic conspiracy, because presumably these people are theists and they just don't get that their ideas just aren't scientific. They just aren't. Like, there's just no getting around it. And so they get very, very angry and frustrated, and they take that frustration out on members of their family that they perceive as being part of the, the great conspiracy or the great bias or whatever it is. And another thing that naturalists find very frustrating, and a lot of people don't realize this, is creationism, especially in the United States, is a very, very lucrative business. There is a ton of money in creationist literature and creationist education. For example, there have been a bunch of vaguely academia-tied creationist books, and they do incredibly well in sales. It's very financially rewarding. And this can be really frustrated for people who are involved in sort of the day-to-day grind of science, so to speak. Many of whom, in fact, most of whom, are really prolific authors, but barely get any financial compensation for those books. And it can be, I think, hard to not be frustrated at the essentially pseudoscientists who are not only very financially successful, but are usually very highly praised and publicized at the same time. There are even entire pseudoscientist think tanks whose whole purpose is to amass wealth and influence just for the sake of creationism, which is super not how science is supposed to be conducted. And that is very frustrating for people who are genuinely trying to conduct science the conventional and, I would say, more honest way. And of course, creationism in private education is also very lucrative, with the resources available to private creationist groups often far above the resources available to public scientific education. And this can be really frustrating for people trying to work in the secular scientific world of education, especially as there is often far fewer resources than they desperately need. And the tendency for creationists and other pseudoscientists to take resources that are so desperately needed by secularists and then use those resources to push demonstratively unscientific ideas as science makes theists many, many enemies in the wider secular community. But with all that being said, and I don't think we should forget any of that, there's a lot of frustration going both ways, and I would say that both sides' frustrations are very valid. But with all that being said, this quote-unquote great debate between, let's say, secularists and theists is pretty overblown. This is mostly because every theistic religion faces as big a threat, if not a bigger threat, from their theistic rival religions than from any naturalist. And this is fundamentally, among other reasons, but fundamentally because naturalists and theists aren't really out to answer the same questions. And if they are, they're certainly not out to answer them in the same way. Whereas, for example, Muslims and Christians are basically asking and answering the same questions, but their answers are direct contradictions and rivals of each other. So while in the West there's a lot of sort of smoke and stink made about the rivalry of theists and naturalists or theists and secularists, the rivalry between religions is always going to be a bigger deal. But even within most theistic religions, there is so much difference of opinion that many so-called theist versus secularist wars are as much civil wars within the religion as anything else. Like, for example, take Christian creationism, which we've been coming back to over and over. Some Christian creationists believe in a literal and essentially mathematic reading of the Bible, leading them to believe in an Earth of only about 6,000 years old. Other creationists decry this as superstitious nonsense and spend a great deal of effort trying to stamp it out. For example, William Lane Craig, who we've mentioned a bunch, is not very pleased and can be downright condescending toward these so-called young Earth creationists. And yet others still believe that any attempt to study or prove holy teachings scientifically is blasphemous, and the only true faith is made without looking to evidence but trusting solely in God. And in my personal experience, the creationists in each of these camps tend to believe that they are the only true faithful, with all others being hellbound heathens. So clearly there is still plenty for theists to debate amongst themselves without naturalists ever having anything to do with it or ever being involved. But just for the sake of our amusement, let's ask the arguably quite silly question. In this so-called great debate, who is winning, atheists or theists? Now, obviously, I'm not terribly highly educated, and I'm certainly not a statistician, but from my limited readings, I think I can answer the question at least well enough for our amusement. So, let's start with the downer. Who is losing? The Christians, I think. Pretty clearly, I would argue. They seem to be pretty broadly losing on all fronts, all over the world, except in pretty specific parts of Asia. I think it's like South Korea and specific parts of China are the only places where Christianity is experiencing steady growth. From my understanding, they're the only religion with declining numbers in the West. The West is pretty much becoming, the Western world being primarily Europe and North and South America, are becoming quite a melting pot of religions. And that seems to be coming at the expense of primarily the Christians. And their growth throughout the whole world has lagged not only behind basically all their rival religions, but I think they're lagging behind global population growth as well. They're growing slower than the population, which basically means that their numbers are declining. So, who's winning? Well, it's not atheists. While atheists are doing very well in the Western world, and in East Asia, atheists have always done well in East Asia, their growth globally is pretty stagnant. In my opinion, the future growth of the atheist community is going to probably depend on whether Muslim and Hindu countries secularize as they develop, and to what extent they secularize. I think that's going to be a big part that determines how many atheists we'll have in the future. So in short, the answer to who is winning is the Muslims. The Muslims are winning all over. Islam is doing incredibly well, not just in the East, but they're growing exponentially throughout the Western world. And I think as the English-speaking academic Muslim community continues to grow, I think this trend is just going to accelerate. I mean, just think about it. We have hardly had any widely publicized debating between Christians and Muslims, and I think it's only a matter of time. And as I mentioned before, given how hardcore the Muslims are about their theology, I think Christian thinkers have a lot to worry about when it comes to debating Muslims. The Muslims do not mess around. So in my humble and only somewhat serious opinion, I don't think the alleged debate between theists and atheists is going to end anytime soon. But I do think we may see a shift in which religion everyone thinks of when we say theist. And on that bombshell, thank you to anyone who was mad enough to stick with me through this whole wild adventure, and have a good rest of your day, and good luck.